Good to see you back. There are a number of reasons to watch an older film: for the quality of the film itself, for great performances of sometimes long dead actors, for the locations which too are sometimes long gone, and as an historical document that represents the tastes of a different time. That final reason is why I'm recommending this film, His Royal Highness from 1932. The film was conceived as a vehicle for comedian George Wallace, one of the most popular Australian stage performers of his day, and by far the most successful on film. It was substantially adapted from one of Wallace's stage reviews, with Wallace and poet C.J. Dennis doing the writing. It showcases Wallace's famous agility, his falls usually onto his left ear, his playing of several musical instruments, and his ability as an accomplished comic tap dancer. This was his first film role, and director Frank Thring, whose early films were largely just photographed stage shows, changed little about his act. Wallace came from a family of comedians. His father was Bronco Wallace, a veteran of blackface minstrel shows. His grandfather was an Irish comic called Pipeclay Wallace, and George was on stage from the age of 3, part of the family act until his parents divorced. After stints in his stepfather's ink and varnish factory and jobs in the bush as a horseman, a cane cutter, a marksman, a boxer and a blacksmith, all before the age of 16, he joined travelling showman Happy Harry Salmon as a comic and general hand. Wallace's career took off immediately after the First World War. Through the horrors of war, Australia and much of the rest of the world had lost its innocence, and Wallace offered audiences a glimpse of the way we once were. Through the 1920s, he toured on a number of the vaudeville circuits and grew to be one of the big 3 acts that included Jim Gerard and Roy Reen, with Reen being by far the most popular. Wallace was influenced primarily by the traditions and stories of the Australian bush and the comic invention of Charlie Chaplin. Wallace's costumes in particular suggest Chaplin's influence, as does the physicality of the way he fell about on stage and screen. However, his clothing and speech represent the Australian working class and contrast with Chaplin's mock dapper tramp persona. Wallace's performances are unique. They combine tap dancing with pratfalls, and his ideas precede comic developments in Hollywood. The fictional country Betonia in this film predates satirical fictional nations such as Fredonia in the Marx Brothers' Duck Soup in 1933 and Tasmania in Chaplin's The Great Dictator in 1940. Unlike other stage comedians of the time, Wallace was always what you'd describe as a clean act, partly because his characters were usually innocent and childish, and they lived near the bottom of the social pile. His clothes rarely fitted, women ignored him and called him fat, but he was resourceful and game when pushed. Filming on His Royal Highness began in February of 1932 at FT's film studios in Melbourne on a budget of £19,000. As well as starring, it is believed Wallace collaborated with Frank Thring on the direction. The film also features Mona Barry in a small part. Barry had made a name for herself on the Australian stage, and after this film, while on her way to London, she was spotted on a New York bus by Fox Film scout Solomon Pincus. She was offered a screen test, signed to a contract, and subsequently appeared in 50 films in the US between 1934 and 1953, in a mix of feature and B films where she spoke with an unmistakable Australian accent. For her contribution to motion pictures, she was given a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame at 6140 Hollywood Boulevard. The film premiered at the Regent Theatre in Melbourne on the 26th of August 1932 and had its general release 3 days later at the Hoyts Deluxe Theatre. The film did solid business, with various theatres claiming it set box office records. It was also sold to Universal in England, where it was widely screened under the title His Royal Highness. Reportedly following the success of this film, Wallace turned down an offer from Universal to film in the US. Reviews were mixed. In Brisbane, the Courier said, "It has shown conclusively that talking pictures of a high standard can be produced in the Commonwealth, and that Australian artists are not one whit behind their Hollywood confreres." The Sydney Morning Herald critic was less impressed, saying, "The humour is of a rudimentary sort. People with simple minds and underdeveloped tastes may enjoy the film, but others are likely to find it a colossal bore." The West Australian noted, "Encouraging things were said about George Wallace, who was hailed as quite a brilliant comedian." The Melbourne Sun said this was the funniest talkie Melbourne has seen. "There is a genius about this film, and there is no need to say it was made in Australia, for it would succeed on its own merits wherever it might be shown." More recently, Film Inc. magazine has said it's a movie of its time, and the musical numbers are fairly ropey, but Wallace's tremendous talent remains evident. The film made Wallace a star in Australia, and he went on to make Harmony Row in 1933 and A Ticket to Tats in 1934, again with Frank Thring and FT Film Productions. This was followed by Let George Do It in 1938 and Gone to the Dogs in 1939, which were directed by Ken G. Hall for Cinesound Productions. Pat Henner bought the rights to some of the old FT catalogue, including His Royal Highness, and gave the film a revival in suburban cinemas, with some modest success. As a result, it was still being screened in the 1950s in Australian theatres. Wallace subsequently influenced Australian comedians such as Barry Humphries and Paul Hogan. His career as one of Australia's most popular comedians spanned 4 decades from the 1920s to the 1960s and encompassed stage, radio and film entertainment. Ken G. Hall, who directed him in 2 films, wrote in his autobiography that George Wallace was the finest Australian comedian he had known. When Wallace died in 1960, it was a time of national mourning. More recently, George Wallace has been the subject of a film documentary, Funny by George, The George Wallace Story, and a stage show about his life, Falling on My Left Ear, a show about George Wallace. So, this is a film of its time. It's incredibly difficult to try and put yourself back into the mind of someone in the 1930s, but I guess it's worth a try. And again, you'll get a sense of, I guess what was entertaining for people at that particular time. Some people would call this film dated, but I think there's still a lot of comedic moments. There's certainly some great physical comedy in this particular film, and some very entertaining musical numbers there as well. Now, some people might not rate George Wallace. George Wallace certainly isn't a household name, but to my mind, he's a far superior comedian to, contemporary popular comics such as, Jim Carrey or Will Ferrell. So what I'd suggest you do is hang around to the end of the video. The next video should be George Wallace in His Royal Highness. Please watch it, see what you think, and as always, we'd encourage you to come back. Let others know what you thought about this particular film and whether you'd recommend it to them. And then we'll see you back again in the not too distant future for our next classic films review. Catch you next time.